Just saying, isn't it cool to be alive in the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence? I was thinking a week ago Saturday when we had the actual anniversary, that on the bicentennial, and most of us in this group can remember the bicentennial, unlike most of the folks probably in your wards. I actually spent the bicentennial in Great Britain, and they didn't celebrate it very much. They had a stamp. They did a special stamp for the bicentennial, but it was not of Washington. Washington's not well liked over there. It was of Benjamin Franklin. I thought that was kind of interesting that the stamp was Benjamin Franklin. But I was serving in Wales in a city called Swansea, and the bishop got up and he said, "Brothers and sisters, today is the 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in America." And he said, in honor of that, because of freedom in America, we have the gospel of Jesus Christ. So he said, we're going to stand and sing the Star Spangled Banner. And so we did. We sang all the verses of the Star Spangled Banner in Wales. And then he walked up to the podium and said, and now we'll sing God Save the Queen. So I was one of the few Americans on the bicentennial who got to sing both the Star Spangled Banner and God Save the Queen. So that was kind of fun. So here's another thing that I will show you that you probably weren't expecting. This is probably not the picture you were expecting me to show in a discussion about God's hand in America's birth. But the reason I tell you this is because there was a survey done just a couple of years ago. A polling group went out to tens of thousands of teenagers across the United States. And they showed them this picture with no information, just this picture. And they said, can you name any of the people in this picture? Okay. 75% of teenagers in America could name all Three Stooges. Now think about it. When did the Three Stooges start? They started in the 30s. They became popular in the 40s. They became really big in the 50s. And by the 60s, when I came along, they were starting to trail off, but they were still popular. But now we are 2 generations removed from the Stooges. Yet 75% of teenagers in America could name all Three Stooges. Now here's where it gets a little scary. They asked those same teenagers, can you name all 3 branches of the American government? 40%. So 75% can name all Three Stooges. Only 40% could correctly name all 3 branches of government. And then they said, can you name any rights included in the First Amendment? Any of the rights? 25%. I would suggest we're doing something wrong. Okay? I would just suggest when 75% knows the Stooges and 25% can even name freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. I mean, we're just not doing it right. So I would call on your help with friends and family, and especially the rising generation. Help them. I'm going to do one thing here. I'm going to put a Kleenex box in front of that fan because it's blowing hot air on me, and the last thing I need on a day that's 108 degrees is more hot air. I would turn your attention to Alma, chapter 37, verse 13. Alma's talking to his sons here. It's a wonderful, wonderful section of the Book of Mormon. And he encourages his son. He says, oh, remember. And remember, there was a talk given in conference about the remember comments in the Book of Mormon. I think there are 6 of them, if I remember right. But he says, remember, if you'll keep my commandments, ye shall prosper in the land. That's the key. We can have all the political debates we want. We can have all the budget debates we want. But if we want to remain a free nation under God, all we have to do is keep the commandments. And the rest, it says in the Doctrine and Covenants, no weapon formed can harm us. That's the answer. Well, I want to talk about 1 Nephi chapter 13, verses 14 to 19. You know this part of the Book of Mormon. Nephi hears his dad tell about this super cool vision that he had and dream about the tree of life. And Lehi explains a lot of things, but not everything. And so Nephi says, I want to understand all about this, and I'd really love to see the dream too if I can. And so he gets a heavenly messenger who walks him through the dream, and then he says, because you've asked, I've got more to show you. And what he shows him in 1 Nephi 13 in those verses is the American Revolutionary War. And during 1976, so 50 years ago, I haven't confirmed this, but it's my hunch, and I think I'm correct, that more apostles spoke at BYU in devotionals in 1976 than any other year in BYU's history. Because it was the bicentennial, and all the apostles wanted to speak at BYU, and they all spoke on America. You can find these at speeches.byu.edu. Speeches.byu.edu. Look at the 1976 devotionals. I want to zero in on two of them. Two of the apostles that came and spoke were Ezra Taft Benson and Marion G. Romney. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you scripture from 1 Nephi, and then in parenthesis, in brackets, in red, I'm going to show you what either Elder Benson or Elder Romney said about that. Because you've sat in Sunday school classes and read something like this, and it came to pass that I beheld many multitudes of the Gentiles upon the land of promise, and somebody's raised their hand and said, hey, that's the pilgrims. And then others have said, I'm not so sure. Well, this is prophetic commentary. Here's the first of it. Elder Benson said, among them were the Puritans in New England, the Quakers in Pennsylvania, the Catholics in Maryland, the Huguenots in Virginia and the Carolinas, and the Lutherans in Georgia. You can take that to the bank. That's who Nephi's seeing. And then Nephi says, and I beheld the Spirit of the Lord, and it was upon the Gentiles. And Elder Romney said, that's the American colonies, folks. Make no mistake. And they, the colonies, did prosper and obtain the land for their inheritance, the colonial lands. And it came to pass that I, Nephi, beheld that the Gentiles who had gone forth out of captivity from Europe did humble themselves before the Lord, and the power of the Lord was with them in the 13 original colonies. And I beheld that their mother Gentiles, the British, were gathered together upon the waters, and also the land also, to battle against them. And then Elder Benson said, so we don't mistake it, in the American Revolutionary War. Nephi is seeing a full-color preview of the Revolutionary War. And then Nephi says, and I beheld that the power of God was with them, the colonists, and also that the wrath of God was upon all those that were gathered together against them to battle. And I, Nephi, beheld that the Gentiles that had gone out of captivity, the colonists, were delivered by the power of God out of the hands of all other nations. And the colonies were able to win freedom in the Revolutionary War. It is so improbable. This is the bridge at Concord. But it is so improbable that we win. It's like Zimbabwe besting the United States in a military conflict. Let me just share something that I wrote earlier. I'll give you a link to this at the end. You can download a copy of this paper that's got most of this in it. But the sheer improbability of an American victory in the Revolutionary War is staggering. By all the standard measures of military contests, population, power, wealth, size, experience of the respective armies, navies, depth, and experience of the country's military leadership, diplomatic power, connections, political organization, etc., Great Britain should easily have been victorious. To face the most professional army and navy in the world, the American colonists could field only an army of volunteer militia and a few undergunned ships, many of which we sank ourselves accidentally. It had never happened in the history of the world. Let me say that again. Never in the history of the world had a colony rebelled against the mother country and been victorious. Carthage rebelled against Rome, if you remember, in the Punic Wars. What did Rome do? Flattened the city, crucified the inhabitants, and salted the city, and salted the fields. That's what happened when you lost in the ancient world. The fact that we win, it's just staggering. And we, yay that our declaration has reached its 250th anniversary. I'm going to quote from some historians and some theologians from the 19th century. I want to start with one. This is a historian by the name of Robert Thompson. He wrote around the turn of the 20th century. He called the surrender at Yorktown God's unique gift to America. And I would say that is just the perfect phrase. It is just a unique gift to us. In 1861, in July 7th, so almost exactly the time we're at right now, John Bigelow was a Protestant minister. He was serving in Reeseville, New York. That's upstate New York. This is right before the Battle of Bull Run, for those of you from the north, and the Battle of First Manassas for those that are from the south. When we lived in Virginia, I learned to call it Manassas way more than Bull Run. Bull Run now sounds funny to me because we just lived 10 miles from the battlefield. But Reverend Bigelow was talking to his congregation, and he wanted the young men to enlist. Lincoln had called for 75,000 soldiers to volunteer. That's all they thought it was going to take to win the war. And so Bigelow says, "My purpose is simply to verify by a few brief references the presence of God's hand." In 1861, it is so well known that God gave us the Revolutionary War win that Bigelow says, look, I don't have to tell you that stuff. You already know it. Everybody, you already believe it. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. That continues all the way through the 19th century. It starts to drop off at the beginning of the 20th century. Historians and theologians stop and less talk about God's hand in the birth of our nation. But in one of those devotionals that I told you from the general authorities, from the apostles in 1976, this is Elder L. Tom Perry's. This is from his. And so I went back and read all of those devotionals, and they're really cool. I highly recommend them. But when I was doing so, this statement from Elder Perry just struck me. Elder Perry said this: "The evidence is overwhelming of God's hand in the establishment of this nation." And when I read that several years ago, I thought, I'm a product of American schools, and I can't name hardly any examples of God's hand in the Revolution. I believe it, but I just have never been taught. So what I want to share with you is things I found, and this is not exhaustive by any means, but I want to share with you things I found regarding God's hand in the birth of this country. And let's do it with 3 W's, and we'll throw in a bonus W at no extra charge, okay? So the first W is Washington. Washington and the Founding Fathers. The second W, where you get your bonus W, is wartime weather. God puts his finger on the scale for us time and time and time again when it comes to weather in the Revolutionary War. I'll share several of those. And the third one is one you've probably never heard of. And I'd never heard of it until I actually got assigned there to teach on the faculty at the military academy. And that is what's called the West Point chain. And this is not West Point by Syracuse in Utah. That's pretend West Point. Real West Point's in New York. Sorry if anybody's from West Point. But we'll talk about those 3 areas. And so I'll categorize these stories into those 3 areas. So let's start with the Founding Fathers, okay? This is an amazing group of individuals. Oh, that we had some of them to run today. We could use them, I think, in Congress and the presidency. But another reverend, between the War of 1812 and the Civil War, a guy by the name of George Cheever, was giving I found this sermon that Cheever gave. He said, the American cause, at the time of the Revolution, the American cause needed men of able statesmanship. It needed men of diplomatic abilities, those who would be faithful at home and just abroad. It needed men of incorruptible patriotism, those who would fill the offices of government not in the interest of self, but in that of country. How adequately God supplied the men to meet those demands, our constitutional history leaves us in no doubt. It is a staggering assembly of individuals. We focus on just a couple. Adams, Jefferson, Washington. They're all really amazing folks. Boy, if this was in class and a phone went off, you'd owe pizza for the room. Boy, good that we're not in class. But let me share with you the highest accolade or support of voice of support is from the Lord himself. And here's what the Lord said about the founders. that they are wise men whom I, the Savior of the world, whom I raised up unto this very purpose. That's a staggering comment if you think about it. So let's go forward. You can find the story I'm about to tell you. You can find this on YouTube. There's a YouTube clip with President John F. Kennedy. President Kennedy called all the Nobel Prize winners in 1962 into the East Room in the White House, and they set it up in banquet format. And so it's all these Nobel Prize winners and their plus one guests, and they're feeling pretty good. They're pretty proud of themselves. You can see they're all kind of like, yeah, we bad. We're pretty awesome. And so President Kennedy gets up and says this, and I'm tempted to do this in a Boston accent. I like you, so I won't. But he says, I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has been gathered together at the White House. Wow, you can see these Nobel Prize winners, and they're going like, yeah, you are just right, man. John, you got it. We're awesome. And then President Kennedy, he had great delivery technique. He drops the other shoe, and he says this, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. And you can just see these Nobel Prize winners. It's like somebody pokes them with a pin, and they just kind of... But if you think about it, you go, oh, yeah, he's right. He's right. Think about Wilford Woodruff, okay? Wilford Woodruff says this in the 1898 April conference. Now, he is going to die a couple of months later in San Francisco. So this is his very last conference address, and here's what he says. I'm going to bear my testimony to this assembly if I never do it again in my life. And he doesn't. This is his last. That those men who laid the foundation of this American government were the best spirits the God of heaven could find on the face of the earth. Now think, why is Wilford Woodruff so uniquely positioned to bear this testimony? He's met them. They appear to him in the St. George Temple 2 weeks after the temple is dedicated and chew him out for not doing their work. They said, you've had a temple for 2 weeks? Get on with it. Come on. We gave you this nation. Baptize us. And you know who's there? It's the founders. It's the reformers. It's Zwingli and Calvin and Knox and Luther. It's all of the presidents of the United States but two. And you're going to ask me who they are, and it's Buchanan and Van Buren. They're not there. They must have been busy that day. And then, have you thought, when that group appears, they're all not, it's Columbus. I mean, it's people that have figured prominently in American history. But one person is in front of that group. So you've got all the founders, the presidents, the reformers. I mean, this is Columbus. This is an amazing group of individuals. But one person is standing in front of them, and he is the spokesman, and it's that person that addresses Wilford Woodruff. Do you know who it is? It's George Washington. And in the temples of our God, we ordain brethren to be elders when we do their vicarious work. But if you check the St. George Temple records, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin are ordained high priests. George is just different. George is just different. President Wilford Woodruff went on and said, General Washington and all of the men that labored for that purpose were inspired of the Lord. So this is his closing testimony to the church. President Ezra Taft Benson said this, when one casts doubt about the character of these noble sons of God, speaking about the founders, I believe he or she will have to answer to the God of heaven for it. There have been a lot of histories in the last 20, 25 years trying to debunk the founders. And they weren't perfect by any means. But they were inspired and they were put there by God. And I just find that statement from President Benson sobering. So let's look directly at George. George has a rough relationship with his mother. His mother, Mary, she goes to Congress during the Revolutionary War, gets up, speaks to Congress, and they think she's going to talk about how great, we're doing and how important it is. No, she's whining that George isn't sending her enough money. So you get an idea, and so she asks Congress for money so I can eat and not starve because George is such a meanie. So you get kind of a feel for Mary. Mary's not, she's not George's biggest buddy. But she says this shortly before her death: "Go, George, fulfill the high destinies which heaven appears to have intended for you." Even Mary Washington, who is George Washington's biggest critic, recognizes this guy is just different. He is the indispensable man. Without him, we would have had a hard time winning the Revolutionary War. Without him, we would have had a hard time establishing constitutional traditions. The reason the Constitution gets passed is because everybody knows Washington is going to become president. Everybody knows it. Do you know how many electoral votes he gets? All of them. Twice. Today, if we have a 51% in the Electoral College, we declare it a landslide. George gets all the votes twice. Everybody just knows George is going to be the president. So let's talk about George at the Battle of the Monongahela. And I put this in because Monongahela is just a fun word to say, okay? Monongahela, it's a river in the Ohio territories. And so George has been out there surveying it, so he knows it. He is asked to go out with General Braddock, and they're going to confront the French and the Indians out there because the French have been building forts in what the British consider their territory in the Ohio's. George is an American militiaman. He's tried to get a British commission. The British have spurned him, but he's still invited to go because he knows the territory. He tries to tell General Braddock, "General, you don't understand. The Indians and the French won't fight according to your rules. You're wearing bright red, you're walking through the woods, you might as well just have a target on your forehead. They won't confront you on an open field like they do in Europe, and they will shoot your officers first." And Braddock's response is basically, "Well, that's not very sporting, nor against, that's against the rules." And being an American officer for 30 years, I think not shooting the officers is a really great rule, personally. But just as George predicts, they are ambushed by the French and the Indians. Braddock is shot in the stomach. He will soon die. The officers are shot out first. They shoot the British officers. Things are completely falling apart. Washington, who has no authority at the site, steps forward, rallies the men, and basically saves the day and helps them retreat and saves most of their lives. But Washington then, as he takes the army back, they come to the nearest village, and this is from a letter to George's little brother, John. George has an older brother, Lawrence. That's who he inherits Mount Vernon from, and then a little brother, John. "As I have heard since my arrival at this place," so by the time they get to this little village, reports have already gone forward. He says, "I've heard of a circumstantial account of my death and dying speech. I take this early opportunity of contradicting both and assuring you that I now exist and appear in the land of the living by the miraculous care of Providence that protected me beyond all human expectation." And then this is what George writes his brother: "During the Battle of the Monongahela, I had 4 bullets through my coat." They're so close, they're going through his clothes, they don't touch him. "And I had 2 horses shot under me." So 2 of the horses he's riding are shot and killed. He gets 4 bullets through his coat. He's not scratched. He says, I escaped unhurt. 15 years later, we have an account from James Craik. James Craik was George Washington's childhood friend. He was actually a physician. Full story, it's Craik that actually ends up killing Washington inadvertently because he bleeds him when he's sick right before the turn of the 19th century. But Craik is a dear friend. And Craik reports this. He says that he and Washington traveled together on an expedition to the Western country. This is 15 years after the Battle of Monongahela. He says, while near the junction of the Great Kanawha and Ohio rivers, a company of Indians came to them with an interpreter, at the head of whom was an aged and venerable chief. This person each made known to them by the interpreter that hearing Colonel Washington was in the region, he had come a long way to visit him, and added that during the Battle of the Monongahela, he had singled out Washington as a conspicuous target, because Washington's on the horse, getting horses shot out from under him, rallying the men so they're not wiped out. This chief fired his rifle at Washington many times and directed his young warriors to do the same. But to his utter astonishment, none of their bullets, took effect. He was then persuaded. So he's got all his warriors firing at one guy. They can't hit him. He was then persuaded that the youthful hero was under the special guardianship of the Great Spirit, and he immediately ceased to fire at him. He had now come to pay homage to the man who was apparently the particular favorite of heaven, he who could never die in battle. Quite a story. Let's tell you about the Battle of Princeton. We'll talk about the Battle of Princeton in weather as well, because Princeton figures multiple times. But the Battle of Princeton fought at Princeton, New Jersey, and the British line up, the Americans line up. There's about 40 yards between them. So think of a football field, okay, from the 30-yard line to the 30-yard line. Okay, that's how far they're apart. And they're whaling away at each other, and they've got muskets. Difference between a musket and a rifle is a rifle has grooves down it, so when you fire, the bullet expands, fills the barrel, spins, and comes out straight and goes where you shoot. A musket, the ball's not quite the same size as the barrel, and when you fire, it bounces down the barrel, and then it goes up whatever angle it's on the last bounce. So you might fire this way, and the bullet might go this way, or you might fire this way, and the bullet go that way. That's why they stand shoulder to shoulder and all fire together, because if you get enough people firing, some of the bullets are going to go down range. That's the theory of a musket, okay? And so the British are shooting, the Americans are shooting. The Americans start to waver. They're just militiamen, and they're facing British regulars. So the American militia are starting to give way. Washington sees this and jumps on a horse. And there are reports that he was the best horseman in North America. Also reports he was one of the best dancers in North America. So the ladies used to love to dance with Washington. But what he does, instead of riding up behind the men and cheering them on, he decides to ride between the British and American lines. Okay, they're wailing away at each other with muskets. Washington rides between them. So he's about 20 yards from the British soldiers. Well, if there's a guy on a big horse closer to you than the enemy, who are you going to fire at? So all the British turn their muskets on Washington and unload. Washington, the smoke clears. The Americans are aghast. We've just lost our commander-in-chief. The smoke clears. Washington's still on the horse, and he's yelling, "Get him!" Well, they see that Washington has been spared, and it rallies the militia, and we win the Battle of Princeton. Okay? It's because of Washington's bravery. So, going to fast forward, and then we'll come back into the war. But at the end of the war, King George III, just here's what's going on in the colonies. He's just stunned. He can't picture that they've lost, because everything says they'll win, and they lose. So he wants to find an American. The American he can find is Benjamin West. Benjamin West is a court painter. He's painted King George multiple times. He's born in America but trained in London. And King George has sat for him numerous times for official portraits. So they know each other very well, because if you sit for a portrait, it's weeks of time. So West has had a lot of time to get to know the king. And the king asked Benjamin West this. He says, "Mr. West, what do you hear from your countrymen regarding your Washington?" And Benjamin West says, "Your Majesty, I hear that he's going to renounce his commission and return to being a gentleman farmer in Virginia." And the king, this account is from Benjamin West. Benjamin West says, the king was silent for an extremely long time. Now, probably a minute maybe, but if you're with the king and he's not talking, that's a long time, okay? So the king is just sitting there. Finally, the king says, "Mr. West, I do believe that if your Mr. Washington does that, he, sir, may be the greatest man in all the world." And I would agree. I would agree. Well, let's change gears. Should we talk about wartime weather? Okay. First, let's talk about the Battle of Bunker Hill. There's nothing miraculous in the weather at Bunker Hill. And first, I would note the Battle of Bunker Hill is not fought on Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill is fought on Breed's Hill. The first guy to report the battle doesn't know Boston geography very well, and he mixes up Breed's and Bunker Hill, but Bunker Hill sticks with the history books. If you go to Boston today and you go to Bunker Hill, there's a sign that says, "Go to Breed's Hill." Okay? And then when you get to Breed's Hill, it says Battle of Bunker Hill, and you're like, but just so you understand, the Battle of Bunker Hill is really, it's a Pyrrhic victory for the British. They win, but they lose more soldiers. But we can see this forces Congress to realize we need a professional army as best as we can do. So it's following the Battle of Bunker Hill that Washington is selected as the commander of the militia forces, the American volunteers. Washington helps the process along because the day they're going to vote, he wears a full uniform with epaulettes into Congress. Kind of like, yeah, I know, I'm the guy. You're going to vote for me. And they do. But that happens after Bunker Hill. So Washington then goes to Boston, surveys the situation, and says, we need cannon. We need cannon. We don't have any. But about the same time, so this is June, and actually just right before that, a couple of weeks before, Fort Ticonderoga sits at the base of Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain is up north in New York, just south of the Canadian border. It's a very long, skinny lake. And Fort Ticonderoga was manned by a British garrison. When you go to Fort Ticonderoga, that gate you can see right by the flagpole. There was supposed to be 2 guards there. One of the guards had stepped away, don't know for what reason. The other guard did not lock the door. So Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys show up and basically walk into Fort Ticonderoga. It's in the middle of the night. They find the commandant's bedroom. They don't knock. They just open the door, point their bayonets at his head, and wake him up. He wakes up, and he's got all these bayonets pointing at his head with muskets attached to him. And he is told, sir, we have taken command of the fort. And he's like, okay. But what Fort Ticonderoga has is 50 cannons. And so news of this victory reaches Washington, because it takes a while for news to travel. It reaches Washington pretty much in conjunction with his arrival there. And so he gets a hold of this guy, Henry Knox. Henry Knox, he's missing a couple fingers on one hand. He's a bookseller in Boston. He becomes one of Washington's trusted confidants. He becomes actually the first Secretary of War under Washington in the first cabinet. But Henry Knox, as a bookseller, every book he got on artillery, he would read it first and then put it up for sale. So he was a self-taught artillerist. And George Washington says, Henry, go get the cannon for me. Bring them to Boston. So Henry Knox says, okay. Well, there's no east-west roads in America in the 1770s. The only roads we have are rivers. That's why the rivers are such a big deal. The roads are awful. I mean, world-class awful. And so Henry's got a real problem because there's no roads between Boston and Fort Ticonderoga. And Fort Ticonderoga is in the middle of nowhere even today. So he says, how are we going to do this? As they're heading to Ticonderoga, the plan develops, and God sends snow and blankets the ground from Ticonderoga to just outside Boston. There is solid snow on the ground. And they're able to break the cannons down, put them on sleds, and they make spectacular time to Boston. And bring the cannon there. Well, let's talk about Boston for just a second, because this is where the cannon are coming. That's Boston in 1775 and 1776. It's almost an island. It's technically a causeway, but it's a really narrow, the Book of Mormon talks about the narrow neck of land. That's the narrow neck of land in Boston. And it's really, really skinny. It's basically a toll gate and a couple of buildings. And so Boston is mostly an island. Then above it, let's see, I don't know if my laser is not working here. But down at the bottom, the white there, that's the Dorchester Heights. It's some cliffs that overlook basically the island of Boston. And so what Washington's plan is, if we can put cannon on the Dorchester Heights, we can point them downhill, and anybody can shoot a cannon downhill. And we'll scare the bejeebers out of the British. So he says, that's our plan. And on March 4, 1776, when the cannons arrived, the Americans put up what are called fusillades. It's like a basket made out of wood, and then you put it up where you want it, and then you fill it full of rocks and dirt, and it makes a quick fort. And so they make a fusillade fort with cannon cutouts, And when the British awake, when they went to bed, there was nothing on the Dorchester Heights. When they awake the next morning, they are faced with a fort and 50 cannon. General Howe says, "Good God, sir, my men could not have done such a feat in 3 months. Washington and his irregulars have done it in 1 night." He's just stunned. He realizes that if he lets the Americans keep the cannon there, they're going to learn how to use them, and Boston is vulnerable. So what he does is he immediately says, get in the boats, because you can't get enough soldiers out that narrow neck of land and up the Dorchester Heights. He says, row across from Boston to the Dorchester Heights, scale the heights, and take the cannon. Just as he says that, a blinding snowstorm breaks out. This is March, but the snowstorm is so fierce and the winds are so bad that it blows any boats that are trying to sail back into Boston Harbor. They can't launch a single boat. Washington and the soldiers up on the Dorchester Heights are not in a snowstorm. They're watching the British flail in Boston. That'd have to be a fun experience. And so Sir William Howe, the British commander, orders the evacuation of Boston. Washington wins his first major victory without firing a shot. And Washington releases this to his troops, that this remarkable interposition of Providence, the snowstorm, the snow to get the cannon there, just the miraculous taking of Boston, that this remarkable interposition of Providence, and Providence, by the way, is the word Washington uses for God. You don't find God very often in his writings. Providence is what he uses for God. Is for some wise purpose, I have no doubt. Well, that's March. Let's fast forward to August. Washington's army is now in New York City. And they're on the Brooklyn Heights by the East River. And Lord Howe has regrouped, gotten reinforcements, and is landing thousands and thousands of soldiers. This is some of the first Hessians to land in the Americas that are contracted out of the German, Prussian states. Washington has now got to defend against them as they come up from Long Island. He is outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1. There are accounts of militiamen that said it appeared as if the entire forests of Britain were afloat. There were so many ships on Long Island disgorging soldiers. It's August. Washington knows he's about to be flanked, and if he loses in New York City, the revolution is over. So what does he do? He commandeers. He sends all his fishermen out. He's got some New England fishermen. They go talk to other fishermen. They get everything that can float, everything from a rowboat to a raft to a small sailing ship. It's kind of like the evacuation at Dunkirk, except in the 18th century. And they bring them to the East River, and he starts sending back soldiers. And so what the front lines do is if there's 4 soldiers, they'll send every other one back. And the 2 that are left will light more fires. Then they'll send every other one back, and they'll light more fires and clank on pans and make noise. But what happens while that is going on is a fog rolls in. And the fog is so thick you can't see the other side. The British can hear us, but they don't know where we are, and they don't know we're withdrawing. So we're rowing people across the East River the entire night, getting them out of there. This is James Talmadge. Talmadge was a colonel and Washington's spy master. And just a quick funny story from Talmadge. He's one of the last to evacuate. And he gets to the other side, and he realizes he left his horse. So he does what the army can do, and he says, I'm a colonel, you're not. You're with me, you're with me, you're with me, and you're with me. Row me back, we're going to get my horse. So I've just pictured this horse standing up in this rowboat. But anyway, he gets the horse back, and the horse survives. But now, what if you're one of those few soldiers left as the fog starts to lift? You're facing thousands and thousands of British regulars and Hessians. The fog is lifting. You're about to be overrun and killed. We have Samuel DeForest, a Connecticut militiaman, for this account, and I'll just share it. So just at that moment of extreme peril, Samuel writes, a most wonderful thunderstorm took place. You don't hear thunderstorms often called wonderful, but this one was because it saved his life. It commenced about 1 o'clock in the day. The thunder and the lightning were dreadful. The clouds run so low. The darkness was so great that the 2 armies could not see each other. This is in the middle of the day. although within 100 rods of each other. Okay, what's a rod? 16 feet, something like that. So God sends the fog at night and then sends this thunderstorm and darkness during the day. And Washington evacuates his entire army. It's just like Dunkirk. Everybody gets out. It's a huge victory for the Americans, even though it's a tactical defeat. Well, let's talk about crossing the Delaware. By the way, this wonderful picture is not historically accurate. If Washington had been standing there looking all majestic, he would have gone in the drink. Because ice was smacking the boat and the boats were rocking all the way across. There's no way he stood up. he was sitting down hugging the side just like everybody else. But it makes it a really nice picture. It was so cold. It was snowy. There was tons of ice in the river. The Hessian commander, Colonel Rolfe, who was at Trenton, knew the conditions outside. He knew it was rotten. He knew there was ice in the river. He said, there's no way Americans can come and attack us. So he gave his Hessian soldiers Christmas to get drunk, and this was on the 26th. Washington, they crossed the Delaware in a snowstorm, and it muffles the noise. Okay, so the snowstorm helps them. The snow also lets them move their cannon quicker because they, again, put them on sleds, and they can now glide instead of having to pull them through the bad roads. Rolfe is warned by a British loyalist. A loyalist spy sees Washington crossing the Delaware and sends a note to Colonel Rolfe. And the note says, the Americans are crossing. You need to arm. Rolfe is playing poker and has a winning hand, and he doesn't want to read the note and let his cards be seen, so he tucks the note in his pocket. The Americans find the note later on his dead body. But it's a tremendous an overwhelming American victory. We completely catch the Hessians by surprise. And this saves the revolution because it convinces enough soldiers to re-enlist because their enlistment was going to expire in 5 days. And this tremendous victory just keeps the army together. Well, now let's talk about the Battle of Princeton. Remember, that's where Washington rides between the armies? So there's more to that story. The British commander says, I'm going to flank the Americans. Flanking is when you come in and you come in from their side or the rear. He says, I'm going to flank the Americans and surprise them. The weather is unseasonably warm and all the roads turn to mud. This is January, okay, of 1777. The British forces make 1 to 2 miles per day. You don't flank anybody making 1 to 2 miles per day. Washington says, they're trying to flank us, let's flank them, so we'll flank the flankers. When he makes that decision, the temperature drops 40 degrees, the roads freeze completely solid, and Washington's forces make 11 miles in one night. And when the British awake, there are the Americans. It's a complete tactical surprise. And it catches the British off guard. Let's talk about Valley Forge. We always talk about what a horrible experience that was with soldiers with no uniforms. When soldiers would die, most of them died of dysentery, by the way. When soldiers would die, the remaining soldiers would strip the corpses because they needed their boots and clothes. But because it was so cold, Valley Forge, if you've ever been there, it's not that far from Philadelphia. And the British held Philadelphia. What stopped the British from coming out and attacking the Americans in their weakened condition at Valley Forge? It was an awfully cold and miserable winter. The British just didn't want to come out. And so that cold that was so awful at Valley Forge actually saved the army. We talk about the winter of that first winter in Valley Forge, but the worst winter of the war was actually 1779, 1780. It was the coldest winter of the entire 18th century. And knowing how cold Valley Forge was, that really says something. But let's put it in context. The Army didn't go to Valley Forge, they went to Morristown in New Jersey for their winter quarters. It was the 6th year of the war, and they were experiencing 3,000% inflation. Now, we had 10% inflation 2 years ago. Did anybody here like that? Was that a good experience? How would you like 3,000% inflation? So they were dealing with that while they're fighting the British. And it was just crazy cold. These two quotes will just give you an idea of how cold it was. Washington wrote to Lafayette and said, there's nobody alive that remembers this much cold. And it turns out it is actually documented as being the coldest winter in the entire century. General Johann de Kalb says, it's so cold, I'm sitting by the fire. I'm sitting by the fire. My clothes are just about ready to catch on fire. I'm so close. And the ink is still freezing in my pen. That's cold, okay? That's really cold. But because it was so cold, something really interesting happened. New York Harbor froze to a depth of 12 feet. I lived in New York for 8 years, and New York Harbor never froze. The Hudson froze many times, but the New York Harbor never froze. It froze to a depth of 12 feet. That's how cold it was. But that allowed the Americans to put on ice skates and attack the British from the ocean side. Because they're all looking out this way, and the Americans sneak up on them from the ocean. It just scares them to death. And they try to follow after the Americans, but they don't have skates, and so they're just slipping and sliding, and the Americans get away. It's a tactical failure. Doesn't make any real difference in the war, but boy, psychologically, it just freaked the British completely out. Well, let's tell you another story. This is Daniel Morgan, great tactician, and that's Tarleton Bannister. If you've seen the Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot, Tarleton Bannister is portrayed in that movie. And from historical accounts, it's a pretty accurate portrayal. He was kind of a monster. What happens is Bannister is following Morgan, and he's just about to catch him. He's a couple hours away. But Morgan's a really street smart guy, and he's had all the local fishermen, like they did in the East River, put all the boats on their side of the river on the Catawba. The Catawba is a river in South Carolina. And this is January 1871, by the way. And so they reach the Catawba. All of Daniel Morgan's guys get in the boats, row to the other side. Tarleton Bannister's forces show up. So he sends his best swimmers across the river, and then, Morgan takes off. He sends his best swimmers across the river to get the boats, bring them back. We're going to follow Morgan. We're going to catch him. We're going to kill him. Just as they are reaching the boats, it starts raining. And by all accounts, it's a rain of biblical Noah flood proportions. It's just a crazy rain. And the river rises multiple feet within minutes. And the current becomes so swift in the Catawba River, they can't navigate any boats. Any boats they put in the river just get washed down the river. And so Daniel Morgan's forces just escape. Well, fast forward a couple of weeks. Same thing happens, except this time it's Nathaniel Greene and his mountain boys, and it's Lord Cornwallis who's chasing him. Cornwallis is so intent on catching Greene that he tells his soldiers, leave your knapsacks, leave your blankets, leave your food, just bring your rifle and your ammunition. We need to travel fast. We're going to catch these guys and kill them. They reach another river in that area. Same thing happens. Greene goes across with the local boats. As Cornwallis is trying to cross the river, rain breaks out, the river floods, they can't cross. Cornwallis then is angry that Greene's gotten away. So he goes back to a place called Yorktown to sulk. And he's waiting for the British fleet to come pick him up and take him back to New York. Whoops, mistake. Because it's not the British that show up, it's the French. And they bottle up the Chesapeake and then land soldiers, and they dig slowly up to Yorktown, and the rest is history, and Cornwallis surrenders. Weather multiple times is changed by God, and it's always at the exact right time, the exact right weather, and it always favors the Americans. I found no examples where the British were ever favored by strange weather. God just puts his thumb on the scale. Well, the third W, remember what that was? West Point chain. So let's tell you that story. I had not heard of the West Point chain until I got assigned to West Point. Just a story I hadn't heard. This is the Hudson River. Beautiful river. My home was just off the bottom of the picture there. We were really lucky. We got one of the really big homes the second time, and it was just fun to look at the Hudson Valley every morning. But West Point is called West Point because it's pointy, and it's on the west. So it's West Point. That's why West Point is West Point. The Hudson River, though, is glacial. It was carved out by glaciers, and it's 600 to 700 feet deep. So that's a really, really deep river right there. And the Indian name for the Hudson River is river which flows both ways, because the Hudson is tidal. We used to get porpoise at West Point. we'd go down and look at the dolphins and porpoise, because they would come in with the tide, because the tide would go clear to West Point. So the Indians used to get in a canoe by West Point and let the tide carry them down to New York City. And then when the tide was coming in again, that's when the tide was going out. When the tide was coming in again, they'd get in the canoe and it would take them back to West Point. You didn't have to row either way. So the river that flows both ways. But West Point is a really key strategic point. This is a letter from Washington to General Israel Putnam. And he says, the importance of the Hudson River in the present contest and the necessity of defending it are subjects which have been so frequently and fully discussed, so well understood, it's not necessary to enlarge on them. Look, Israel, you already know, Hudson River's really big deal. The reason the Hudson River is such a big deal is whoever controls the Hudson controls New England. And so you can't lose the Hudson River. The British had all kinds of man of war on the Hudson from New York up towards Albany, but they said, we've got an idea of what to do. So what the Americans did, West Point is further up the river. I'll show you in just a moment. But at a place called Stony Point, the Americans said, let's put a chain across the river. So they made a chain of about 1 to 2 inches for each link. They anchored it on both sides of the Hudson, and they put forts on both sides so the British couldn't take a ship through the chain. Well, great idea, bad place. The British just attacked both forts, sank the chain. So if anybody wants a chain, if you're willing to go salvage it, it's at the bottom of that 600-foot river. It's still there. So they said, well, okay, it was a good idea. We had a great idea, but we did it in the wrong place. Let's do it at West Point, further up the river. Because at West Point, the river makes a lazy, almost a Z. So what happens is as the ships are sailing north, as they approach what's called Constitution Island, and it's not an island, it's actually a peninsula, but they call it Constitution Island. As you approach Constitution Island, you have to come to a dead stop if you're a sailing ship. Then you tack your sails and you sail about 400 yards, then you stop, tack your sails, and sail north towards Polypel Island and Newburgh and up towards Albany. Well, if you're on the shore and you've got cannon, your targets are going to come to a complete stop twice. How polite is that? So you're going to train your cannon on those 2 spots, and then they said, let's put a chain in the middle of those 2 spots, because when they come to a complete stop, they can't get enough speed to break our chain. Okay, so that's why West Point, that's why the military academy is at West Point. It's the longest garrisoned place in North America. Here's the theory. They were going to take the chain, because if you get that many links across a several hundred-yard river, it's a heavy chain. Metal doesn't float real well. So how do you make a big, heavy 80-ton chain float? Well, you take logs, dip them in tar, and then float the chain on the logs. That's the theory. So that's what it's going to look like. And then you interlock your cannon fire. So each of those lines is artillery fire. Okay, so they're just going to blanket that area. The fort was originally called Fort Arnold. It was soon renamed to Fort Clinton, because everybody in American history knows Benedict Arnold was a traitor, right? Well, I used to think that. I had some work done on my house this week by some 20-somethings, and somehow that American history things came up, and so I said, you know the story of Benedict Arnold? They had never heard of Benedict Arnold. I'm like, wow, but you know who the Three Stooges are. But Benedict Arnold, what he did, we know that he's a traitor. Most people know that. But nobody knows what he did. Here's what he did. He was the commander of West Point, and he gave the plans for where the cannons were and the forts, because there were dozens of interlocking forts. Some of them were very tiny, called redoubts. One of them was in my backyard at West Point, Redoubt 17. And so he was giving the plans so that when the British attacked, they would know where the forts were, so they could defeat West Point and sink the chain. The British spy got caught, Major Andre got caught with it in his boot, and the British didn't get the plans. But that's what Benedict Arnold did. But here's I think, the real miracle of the chain. It's a place called Sterling Mine. In 1765, so just a couple years before the war started, people had been living there for over 150 years. Nobody had noticed what they found in 1765. What they found was there's iron ore, and it's just on the surface. It's 60 to 70% black magnetite. Now, I didn't know a lot about iron ore until I started digging into the West Point chain. Magnetite is that's like the Cadillac of iron ore. Most iron ore, you have to dig it out of the ground, and then you do what's called washing. You get rid of all the dirt, so it keeps the ore. And washing is very time-consuming. The ore at Sterling Mine was so rich, you could dig it from the ground and throw it in the fire. They did not have to wash it, okay? At the time, it was the purest iron ore in the entire world. Now, here's the really cool part. It's 3 miles from West Point. God knew he was going to need a chain across the Hudson River, so he put the richest iron ore in abundance 3 miles from West Point. The Sterling furnaces, this is the remains today when you go to Sterling Forest. The Sterling furnaces, there were 7 forges, 10 big fires. It was a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operation to throw that iron ore into the smelter to make the great chain at West Point. Because they said the previous chain had links of 1 to 2 inches. We're going to make this chain with links of 3 to 3.5 to 4 inches. And the cold that was so bad at Valley Forge, West Point isn't that far from Valley Forge. That cold allowed them to get closer to the forges while they were making the links. If it had been a warm winter, they couldn't have done it as quickly. But that cold meant they could get right up to the forges because it was so very cold. It was just viewed so differently at Sterling Forge. So here's the specs on the Great Chain. That's one of the links. That's an original link. When you go to West Point, I'll show you a picture in a minute. But it's hundreds of links. Each link weighs 75 pounds. I mean, imagine floating that. The whole thing, I said 80 tons, it's 60 tons. But it's 500 yards long, and there's no machines to put it out. It's all soldiers putting the chain out. From the time Congress said buy the chain until the time they put the chain on the river was 3 months. It's 500 yards long. As was mentioned in the introduction, I used to do contracting for the Army. We can't write a contract. No, I'm dead serious. We can't write a contract in 2 years. Most contracts take 5 to 6 years, and I just read an Army report this week that said most weapon systems are 12 years behind schedule. In the 1700s, they took the contract, built the chain, and put it on the river in 3 months. Stunning. Stunning. This is the end of the chain. If you've ever heard anything about West Point, there's a place called Flirtation Walk. It's where all the cadets get engaged. The chain is anchored at the end of Flirtation Walk. And this is the piece of the Great Chain that's at West Point today. This is on the plain where the cadets march. It's out on the lookout edge where Fort Clinton used to be. And you can pick the links up, and they're heavy. But here's the trick. I mentioned a few minutes ago that the Hudson River froze when I was there several times. And the Hudson River does freeze. And when the Hudson River freezes, it would take a 60-ton chain and break it like a toothpick. Just the force of the ice. So, Washington had to put the chain out every spring and bring it in every fall. If he brings the chain in too early, the weather's good, the British can sail past West Point. If he brings the chain in too late, the Hudson freezes, it breaks the chain and it sinks to the bottom of the river. Washington has to be perfect in the spring and perfect in the fall. And he does this year after year during the Revolution. Guess what? Guess how many he gets right? All of them. And you know how he said he did it? He said, Providence told me when to bring the chain in and when to put it out. And he doesn't miss a one. It's perfect. It's perfect. I mean, the odds against that. But it's the West Point chain that secures New England. Have you ever wondered why does the war suddenly shift from Boston and New York City and New Jersey? Why does it go down to the Carolinas? Why does Cornwallis surrender in Virginia, of all places? Well, it's called the Southern Strategy because Britain has lost New England because of the West Point chain. The Hudson River is no longer a viable river for the British. The British never tried to break the chain and never tried to attack West Point. It's too secure. So they've lost the North. They said, let's win in the South. And that's why they shift their focus. Well, it is a most unlikely victory. Recent studies have shown there's always been the story that the British band played a popular tune from Britain called "The World Turned Upside Down." And that may be true, but there's some recent scholarship that says maybe not. But I still think it's a great story. If it's not true, it's one of those, it ought to be, right? It just ought to be. But Washington, following the victory at Yorktown, releases another general orders to his soldiers, and he says that we need to have the recognition of such astonishing interpositions of providence. God has put his thumb on the scale for us. He's just put the thumb on the scale for us. In 1787, after the failed Articles of Confederation have played out and they're doing the Constitution, Benjamin Franklin rises and says this: "In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room," that's at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, "for the divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard and they were graciously answered." John Dunlap, a minister during the War of 1812, wrote this in 1814, just at the end of the war. "In the short space of 7 years, the most powerful and warlike nation in the world, Great Britain, relinquished all authority over a number of her provinces which she had treated as rebels and acknowledged them sovereign independent states." Again, this had never happened in the history of the world. And then he adds, "This was the work of the Lord and glorious in our eyes." But you know what? We shouldn't be surprised. It's exactly what Nephi saw in vision 23 centuries before. The Lord gave him the details. And I'm guessing Nephi got to see the holographic full-color version. So remember those devotionals I mentioned from 1976 where so many of the apostles spoke at BYU? This is a quote from Elder Marky Peterson's devotional. He said this: "There's only one reason why the United States came into being. Only one reason. It's a different reason from anything that we know in any other nation. There is a United States only because God planned to restore the gospel in the last days, and he had to have a free country in which to do it. And so in order to make that happen, he just put his thumb on the scale for us time and time and time again." So I will close with this statement. Remember John Bigelow, the guy that spoke to the potential recruits in upstate New York right before the Battle of Manassas? John Bigelow said this in his sermon: "To what other nation has God given such a history? To none." And then John Bigelow asked this, and this is the question I would ask you. "Then are we adequately conscious of and adequately grateful for the signal distinction which has been vouchsafed to us? For approximately 10 generations, the previous generation has vouchsafed liberty, democracy, and an understanding of the principles of the Constitution. Please let us not be the generation that breaks that link." And I leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ, amen. I will just put this up. This is, if you go to that website, you can download a copy of the chapter where this presentation, it's not the full presentation, it's a little bit shorter version of it in the chapter, and it doesn't have the scriptural references in the front. The editor cut those out for some reason. But if you go to rsc.byu.edu, search for Alford, you can find this, and it's free. You can download a copy of the article. So thank you very much.